Hi, my name's Venetia, and I came home from burying my husband, to be abandoned by my own blood. I texted them, just one message. Can someone pick me up? My sister replied, try Uber. My mother? You should have planned better. No one came, but that was just the start. What followed was worse than grief. They didn't just leave me at the airport. They left me out of the will. They forged signatures, sold the house my husband and I built together, and then they tried to call me crazy. They thought I'd stay silent. They thought I'd disappear quietly. But they forgot. I buried a husband, not the truth. So before we begin, where are you listening from tonight? Drop a comment and buckle up. Because what they buried with my husband is about to come back to light. I stepped off the plane with my body still aching in places no doctor could fix. 9 months overseas had done little to dull the grief. If anything, it hardened it. The coat I wore was the same one from the last time I held Luca's hand. A light drizzle kissed the top of my head as I exited Charlotte Douglas Airport, the air thick with cold and silence. One carry-on bag. That's all I brought back to a place that once called itself home. My phone buzzed in my hand. I opened the family group chat and typed, "My flight lands at 6 p.m. Can someone pick me up?" Simple. Polite. Clear. 10 minutes passed. I stared at the screen like it owed me something more than indifference. Finally, a reply. Brielle. Try Uber. We're busy. Then another. Mom. You should have planned better. I swallowed. I typed, I understand, and hit send. Outside the airport, the cold crawled into my sleeves. I stood on the curb watching people reunite. Hugs, laughter, those small chaotic moments I used to take for granted. My Uber still said 14 minutes away. I shifted my weight from one foot to the other. Then I saw her. Brielle's car, silver Hyundai. Same old dent on the left bumper from when she clipped Dad's fence 2 summers ago. She stepped out, waving, not at me, but at Kayla, her daughter, who had just gotten off a school bus nearby. Kayla ran to her. They hugged. Brielle smiled wide, brushed hair from Kayla's face, and handed her a hot chocolate. I watched from 10 feet away, invisible. They didn't even glance in my direction. They walked past me like I wasn't there. Not a flicker of recognition, not a pause, just the sound of laughter, fading with distance. I told myself I shouldn't be surprised, but surprise isn't always about what's new, it's what still hurts, even when you see it coming. The Uber app said 8 more minutes. I leaned against a column and pulled the zipper of my coat higher. My fingers brushed the edge of the collar. Luca had once adjusted it for me before we left for the farmer's market in Seville. That day had smelled of citrus and roasted coffee. He'd told me something then. Your silence isn't strength if it becomes your cage. At the time, I'd laughed it off. I'm not caged, I'd said. I'm just composed. Now the words clung to me like the rain. I glanced down at my bag, suddenly remembering the gift I had packed for Mom, a silk scarf I'd found in a little boutique off Calle Regina. It was embroidered with our family's old motto, "What roots do not show, still hold." I unzipped the bag. Shirts, charger, toiletries. No scarf. I dug through everything again. Maybe I left it in Spain. Or maybe it had been taken. Either way, it was gone. The Uber arrived, a muted blue sedan with an older driver who greeted me with a quiet nod. I said nothing as I slid in, folded my coat around me, and stared out the window. The city passed by, lit in oranges and grays, soaked in November rain. The houses looked older, smaller than I remembered. Or maybe I had just grown into seeing their edges. When we pulled up to my childhood home, I saw no porch light waiting. No one opened the door. The house stood like a stranger wearing my memories. I let myself in. The air inside was warmer, but still uninviting. The hallway smelled faintly of lemon cleaner, and whatever resentment was baked into these walls over time. My old room was at the end of the hall. I pushed open the door. Boxes stacked high, labeled XMAS, tools, old photos. A dusty stationary bike blocked the closet. My bed was gone. A note taped to the doorframe read, in Mom's neat but firm handwriting, "Don't touch." No one had cleared space for me. No one had expected me. Or worse, they had, and just didn't care. I sat on the edge of a cardboard box marked Cole's college stuff. My legs trembled slightly, not from fatigue, but from something colder, something emptier. I didn't cry. Not then. Tears would have felt like a request, for sympathy, for recognition. And I knew better by now. Instead, I took a breath. A long one. Then I whispered to myself as I looked at that "don't touch" sign. I'm not here to ask anymore. But what I didn't know was that this was just the first test. The next one would break something far older than my bones. It wasn't the silence that hurt. It was how comfortably they lived in it. I woke early. The kind of early where your body doesn't ask for permission. It just rises from a restless sleep, still wired from a different time zone and a different life. My room, or what used to be mine, smelled faintly of mothballs and cardboard. I pulled on my jeans, grabbed a sweater from the top of one of the moving boxes, and tiptoed down the hall. The kitchen was cold, not just in temperature, but in spirit. The tile floor bit into my bare feet, and the overhead light hummed low like it didn't want to be awake either. I filled the kettle and waited, listening to the house breathe. No footsteps, no voices, just the quiet hum of a home that didn't know how to make room for someone returning. I pulled down the old coffee canister, same one Mom used since I was a teenager. I measured out the grounds like muscle memory, flipped the switch, and stood there until the bitter scent began to warm the room, at least a little. Mom walked in just as I poured the first cup. She didn't look at me, just brushed past, pulled open the fridge, and dug around for something without a word. "If you want breakfast," she said, her back still turned, "you'll have to figure it out. We're on a different routine now." I didn't flinch. I wasn't expecting anything. She turned then. Finally. Her eyes flicked to mine for a second before she closed the fridge. "Good. You shouldn't." I stared down into my mug. The heat from the ceramic didn't reach my fingers. She left the room as quietly as she entered, and I stood there alone, surrounded by the kind of silence that doesn't invite peace. It just confirms you were never welcome in the first place. I sat down at the small table by the window. The same one where we used to carve pumpkins and fold laundry and fight over the last cinnamon roll. My eyes landed on the family calendar stuck to the fridge with mismatched magnets. I don't know why I looked. I guess part of me wanted to see a flicker of acknowledgement, something to suggest they remembered me beyond just being an inconvenience. But it wasn't there. Not my birthday, not my wedding anniversary. The square that used to read Luca plus Venetia Madrid wedding was wiped clean, replaced with a dentist appointment for Kayla. I stood, coffee still in hand, and reached toward the calendar. Before I could even brush it with my fingertip, Mom reappeared like a shadow and tapped my hand, sharp but not hard. "Don't mess with it." I didn't answer. My chest did the talking. Tight, burning, wordless. She left again. I sat down slowly, and the chair creaked like it remembered me even if no one else did. I stared out the window, watching squirrels chase each other across the fence line. My thoughts drifted. I remembered Luca's last week, the way he'd insisted on FaceTiming Mom. "Just once," he'd said. "Let me tell her thank you. Let her see my face. It matters." I called her, told her what he wanted. She said, "I'm tied up with church this week, honey. You know how busy things get before Thanksgiving." I begged her. Told her it mattered more than she realized. She never called him back. 2 days later, I was cradling his hand in a hospital bed, whispering promises I couldn't keep. This morning, I saw her old landline phone still plugged into the wall near the laundry room. I pressed the call log button. His name was still there. Unanswered. Before I could let that sink in, Brielle entered the kitchen, phone in one hand, Kayla's pink hoodie in the other. I offered a quiet smile. She didn't return it. "So," she said, not looking up from her screen, "are you paying Mom back for the hospital bills or what?" I blinked. "Excuse me?" She looked at me then. "Don't act like you forgot. We had to cover some of your stuff while you were laid up overseas." Mom's voice floated in from the hallway. "And that's after you just walked out of here like we don't matter." I stood up slowly, because sudden movements might have made the anger pour out faster than I could control. "What are you talking about? I paid for everything through Luca's insurance." Brielle tossed the hoodie on the counter. "Not everything. Flights, meds, some paperwork junk. We had to handle it." "No one told me." Mom walked in again, this time holding her coffee. "It's not our job to chase you down for responsibility, Venetia. We did what needed doing. You're lucky we were even able to cover it." Something in her tone snapped me out of confusion. It wasn't just frustration, it was entitlement. "And how exactly," I asked, my voice calm, "did you cover it?" Brielle raised her eyebrows like I'd asked a stupid question. "A loan. Through your name. It made sense. You weren't using your credit, right?" I felt the room tilt. "You took out a loan in my name?" "Co-signed," Mom said, sipping like it was no big deal. "Just until you got back on your feet. You forged my signature." "You weren't answering calls," Brielle said, shrugging. "We had to move fast." I couldn't breathe. Not in the normal way. My chest felt like someone had placed bricks inside it and dared me to stand tall anyway. I didn't yell, didn't curse. I just walked out the front door. The cold air slapped my face. I made it to my car, sat in the driver's seat, and turned on my phone. My hands trembled as I pulled up my credit report. There it was. $12,000. Pending. Under my name. And right beneath it, co-signed by Delora Whitlow. I let the phone slide into my lap. I didn't cry. No. What I felt was something colder than grief, sharper than shock. Betrayal. I thought grief was the hardest thing I'd carry home. Turns out, betrayal travels lighter, but cuts deeper. I didn't say a word. I just slid the phone into my coat pocket and turned the key in the ignition. The engine rumbled quietly, like it understood the silence I needed. I didn't go far, just a few blocks to the old park where Dad used to take us when we were kids. It was mostly empty now, just a few runners and a man walking his dog near the pond. I parked under a maple tree, its last red leaves clinging stubbornly to the branches, and stared out the windshield. Everything was so loud in my head. My mother's voice, Brielle's smug face, the name on that loan document, mine. I pulled out my phone again, not to call anyone, just to write. I opened the Notes app, typed 3 lines. Observe, don't trust, collect everything. That was it. No dramatic declarations, no crying fit. Just a quiet promise to myself. And once that note was written, the dam broke, not with tears, but with memory. The funeral, Luca's casket, the smell of salt and stone at the cemetery in Naples. I'd sent the link to the family group chat. A simple message. Luca's service will be Thursday, 2 p.m. Italy time. Zoom link attached if you can't come. Jordan responded. Just one word. I'll be there. Everyone else? Silence. I assumed they were grieving in their own way. Busy. Distracted. I made excuses for them the way I always had. But a week later, Jordan called me. "You know your mom told folks she never got the message," he said. "Told them she didn't even know the funeral had happened." That wasn't a mistake. That was a choice. It had taken so little effort to erase me. Just ignore. Pretend. Move on. By the time the sun dipped lower in the sky, I was still sitting in that car, engine off, phone in my lap. Around 4:30, I drove back to the house. I didn't want to see anyone, but I also didn't want to leave anything behind. Not anymore. I parked in the driveway, walked around to the backyard instead of going inside. The wooden deck creaked under my weight, faded paint peeling from the rails. It used to be bright white. Now it was the color of forgetting. Through the kitchen window, I saw Brielle on her phone, walking circles around the counter. Her voice carried faintly through the cracked window. "She's back, but it's temporary," she was saying. "I give it 2 weeks. Tops. She can't handle real life." I didn't move. I just listened. "She's always been like this," she went on. "Curls up when it's hard, runs, acts like we're the villains." I felt something rise in my chest. Not sadness, not even rage. Clarity. I turned my gaze toward the corner of the yard. The rose bush. The one Luca and I planted during his first visit to Charlotte. He'd insisted on helping me dig the hole, even though he hated dirt under his nails. "I want it to grow like us," he'd said. "Messy, strong, a little too wild." Now it was overgrown, thorns stretching out like warning signs. It hadn't been trimmed, watered, or touched. Just like me, left alone. I crouched beside it, pulled a few dead leaves from the base, ran my fingers gently over a still thriving bloom. Pink, soft, defiant. I pulled out my phone again. This time, I didn't type instructions. I wrote to myself. I buried him with no one beside me, not even a voice message. But I walked out of that hospital, rebuilt my own muscles, and stood. And now I'm back. Not for them. For me. I sat there for another 20 minutes, watching the sky fade into a deeper gray. Then I stood. I walked inside, quietly. No one heard the door open. Mom was in the living room, watching a talk show, her legs propped up on the ottoman. She looked up as I entered. Just for a second, she flinched. I held her gaze, steady. Then I smiled. But it wasn't warm. "Don't worry," I said. "I won't be a burden long." She didn't reply. I climbed the stairs, step by step. But in my head, I wasn't retreating. I was planning. The next morning, the kitchen was just as cold as it had been the day before, not from the temperature, but from the people in it. I moved slowly, not from pain this time, but purpose. I reached for the coffee pot without speaking. The cabinet creaked as I pulled down a chipped mug that used to be my father's. No one acknowledged me. Delora was at the table, flipping through a celebrity tabloid like she hadn't been a no-show at my husband's funeral. Brielle sat across from her, swiping through her phone screen with a smirk plastered to her face that never quite met her eyes. Their silence was their comfort zone, but mine wasn't passive anymore. I sat at the kitchen counter and stirred my coffee, watching them over the rim of my mug. The spoon clinked against the ceramic, the only sound in the room. Not a single word about yesterday, not a question about how I was sleeping, not even a glance to ask if I needed anything. The front door creaked open. Elijah strolled in like he owned the house, keys jingling from his belt loop. "Hey, sis," he said, pausing just long enough to be heard. "Still camping out here? When you heading back to Italy?" His tone dripped with mock surprise, like my presence was some kind of inconvenience. Delora chuckled lightly, never lifting her eyes from the paper. Brielle didn't even pretend to be subtle. She let out a snort and kept scrolling. My grip tightened around the coffee mug. I didn't flinch. I didn't bite back. I spoke clearly, my voice smooth. "I'll go when I feel like I've been home long enough." The word hung there. Home. Let it sting. Let it settle. For once, no one said a thing. I placed the mug down gently and looked at Delora. "I know you think I can't handle real life," I said evenly, "but I survived something none of you could have handled. And just because I didn't invite you to the hospital when my spine shattered doesn't mean I forgot who wasn't there." She didn't meet my eyes. Of course she didn't. Guilt shrinks people. And my mother, she was already small. I left the kitchen with no warning, no dramatics. The screen door creaked behind me as I stepped outside. But the silence I left in my wake, that was thunder. I drove to the grocery store not because I needed anything, but because I needed space. The parking lot was mostly empty, just a few minivans and one delivery truck unloading boxes. I parked near the edge, shaded by a half-dead oak tree, and unlocked my phone. Still no messages. I scrolled upward through a long thread of texts. Months of updates. Luca's ICU schedule, surgery results, funeral details, photos of the gravesite, a video link to the memorial service. Nothing. Just Jordan, my cousin, who'd replied once. The rest, seen, or worse, ignored. I closed the thread and opened my notes app. This time it wasn't a journal entry. It was a list. Who knew but said nothing? Who benefited from my silence? Who needs to feel this next? The questions sat there for a while, blinking back at me. Then I typed a name. Elijah. My phone buzzed, startling me. A spam call. I declined it and turned off notifications. I wasn't ready for the world. I was still stitching together my own. I looked up and realized I'd been sitting for almost 45 minutes. The sun had shifted. I started the car but didn't pull out right away. Something tugged at me, something unfinished. Instead of heading home, I turned left and drove 2 blocks over to Main Street. My brother's real estate office sat just off the corner next to an insurance agency and a vape shop, real classy. There were 2 cars parked outside, my mother's sedan and Brielle's crossover. They didn't even bother to hide it. I pulled across the street and cut the engine, sat there with the windows rolled halfway down. The engine ticked quietly as it cooled. I reached for my phone, opened the camera, pressed record. I didn't zoom in. I didn't talk. I just filmed the building. 10 seconds. Then I stopped. I wasn't gathering dirt. I was documenting patterns. Their secrets weren't going to stay buried just because they had matching bloodlines. I stared through the windshield, my eyes locked on the faded paint of the office sign. Venetia Whitlow. Spineless. Weak. Too sensitive. The labels they'd always used to keep me small. But they forgot one thing. I had time. And silence. And that kind of silence didn't beg. The air inside my car was still and tense, like it was waiting for me to move first. I sat across the street from Elijah's office, hands clenched tight around the steering wheel, heart thudding so loud it seemed to shake the windows. My phone was still recording. The voices inside the building weren't muffled enough to miss. Delora's voice carried first, crisp and unconcerned. "She's not going to stay long. She never does." A short laugh followed. Elijah's. "We ought to talk about refinancing. This place is sitting on value. She won't push back. Honestly, I don't think she's all there these days." Brielle chimed in, flatly. "She's just pretending to grieve. Again." They weren't whispering. They weren't cautious. They didn't even think I could hear them, because they'd already decided I didn't matter. I leaned closer toward the cracked window, holding my breath. My eyes scanned through Elijah's blinds, focusing on the dark wooden desk just inside. He had papers laid out. I recognized one immediately. Dad's original deed to the house. The familiar black border. The faded ink of his signature. There was a new form next to it. A refinancing agreement. 3 signature lines. Only 2 were signed, Elijah and Delora. Mine was missing. My stomach turned, cold and hard. It wasn't enough that they erased my name from conversations, calendars, and condolences. Now they were trying to erase me from our father's legacy. I ended the recording. Not out of fear, out of something sharper, clarity. They were bold because they believed I'd never fight. They thought silence was my way of surrender. I drove off without turning my head back toward the office, every muscle in my body vibrating with restraint. It would have been easy to storm in and call them out. But I remembered what Luca once told me. You can win a war with fire, but sometimes ice lasts longer. That night, after dinner passed without a word spoken to me, not even a glance, I shut my bedroom door and sat on the edge of the bed. My laptop sat unopened on the desk, but it wasn't time to dig through emails or legal papers yet. It was time to remember. From the bottom drawer of my suitcase, beneath a bundle of receipts and folded hospital bills, I pulled out a small envelope. Its edges were worn, the flap slightly torn from being opened and closed too many times. Inside was Luca's last letter. He'd written it on a yellow legal pad, his handwriting uneven from the morphine, but still unmistakably his. He'd tucked it in my coat pocket before the ambulance ride neither of us expected to be our last together. I read the words again. Slowly. Carefully. I know you're alone in this, V. But don't mistake being alone for being powerless. You don't owe them silence. You owe yourself the truth. And the fight. Tears blurred the ink by the time I folded it back up. I pressed it against my chest and whispered to the room. I'm done being quiet. But talking wouldn't be enough. They'd call it paranoia, delusion, drama. I needed more than truth. I needed proof. I opened my laptop and began digging. The search started local. Public records on property taxes, refinance permits, anything I could tie to Elijah's office. Then deeper, emails from Dad's old accountant, scanned receipts from his estate, encrypted backups from my joint account with Luca in Spain. By midnight, I had a folder labeled for later. Not for court yet, not for the confrontation, but for control. Then I turned to another kind of prep, the emotional kind. I walked to the bathroom, turned on the light, and stared at my reflection. My face looked older than it did before Spain, not just in the lines or the shadows under my eyes, but in something deeper. The softness I used to carry, it was gone. I practiced saying it. I know what you did. But the words felt empty. I tried again. You lied. You stole. You left me out because you didn't think I'd fight back. Still not right. I closed my eyes. When I opened them, I stared straight into the mirror and said, softly, but with certainty, you've made a mistake. Thinking I wouldn't notice, thinking I wouldn't care, thinking I'd still protect you. That was it. That was the one. I exhaled and shut off the light. Later that night, I pulled out a second notebook, one Luca hadn't seen. This one was mine. Pages of little observations from the past few days, things I hadn't said aloud, glances exchanged, phrases that sounded rehearsed, details I knew would matter when the time came. I added a new page. Elijah's office, 4:42 p.m., Mom's car, plus Brielle's SUV, refinancing docs. My name missing. Then I wrote one word in capital letters. Motive. My fingers hovered above the keyboard again. There was still more I didn't know, more I couldn't prove, but they had made a critical mistake. They underestimated the one thing I still had: time. 2 days passed, and none of them mentioned the confrontation at Elijah's office. No one brought up the documents I'd seen, not a word about the recording, just business as usual, as if I were still the fragile, passive woman they remembered. So when Delora called that morning, her voice overly light, saying, "Come by the church, sweetheart, just to talk," I knew something was off. Still, I said yes. I didn't bother dressing up. Pulled on jeans, a plain sweater, tied my hair back, no lipstick, no earrings. If they wanted to paint me as worn out and unstable, I'd give them the look, but not the truth. The community church office hadn't changed. The same wood-paneled walls, the same old clock ticking 3 minutes too fast. Pastor Elroy greeted me with a gentle smile, motioning me inside. Delora was already seated, legs crossed, her purse perched neatly on her lap like it had never carried secrets. "Hi, baby," she said, as if we hadn't been at war behind polite silences. Pastor Elroy folded his hands. "We thought a little conversation might help smooth things out, heal maybe." I nodded once, then sat across from them. I didn't take off my coat. Delora started gently, too gently. "We've all been through a lot lately. Your accident, Luca's passing, the move back here. It's no wonder you're overwhelmed." I stayed quiet. She glanced at Elroy, then leaned in. "But I think you're misinterpreting things, imagining slights that aren't there." Pastor Elroy's voice was soft. "Grief can make us see threats where there are none. Maybe stepping away from the legal concerns, for a bit, would give you space to heal." There it was. They weren't worried about my health. They were building a case, trying to get ahead of anything I might reveal, laying groundwork with the community, just in case. I inhaled slowly, then reached into my bag, pulled out a folder. No recordings yet. Those would come later. Inside were copies of the deed history, my rights outlined in plain legal print. On top, Luca's final letter, folded gently, worn at the edges. I set it down on the desk between us. "I know what I'm entitled to," I said quietly, "and I know what you're doing." Delora stiffened. Elroy blinked. "I'm not confused, and I'm not spiraling," I added. "I buried my husband alone. I learned to walk again without a soul from this house lifting a finger. If I can survive that, I can survive this." I stood, pushed the folder slightly closer to Delora. She didn't touch it. Neither did he. "I'll leave you two to process," I said, then walked out without another word. The sun was high and sharp when I stepped outside. I blinked against the light, shoulders tight. It would have felt good, like a victory, if it weren't for the heaviness sitting at the base of my chest. Back at home, I paced my bedroom. The air inside felt stale. I opened a window. Maybe Brielle hadn't meant for things to go this far. Maybe she just followed Delora's lead. Maybe Elijah was the only one truly ruthless. I wanted to believe that. I really did. But truth wasn't something you could vote on. It either stood on its own or collapsed under the weight of silence. Luca's voice echoed in my memory again, soft but insistent. "You don't owe them silence." I pulled out his letter and reread it on the edge of the bed. His handwriting had always looked like it danced, tilted and looping. He'd written it a few weeks before the accident, tucked it into a novel I'd been reading, and never finished. "Don't forget what you already survived," it said. "You don't need to shout to be heard. Just refuse to be erased." I closed my eyes for a moment. When I opened them, I was steady. I sat down at my desk, flipped open my laptop. No more waiting. I opened the document folder on the desktop, started scanning files. House deed, refinance history, bank statements. One by one, cross-checked with dates Brielle had access to Mom's accounts. Legal contacts from Italy. A friend of Luca's had offered help months ago. I'd never followed up. Until now. I began drafting a formal letter to the county, asserting interest in the estate. Just as I was typing, my phone buzzed. Unknown number. I almost ignored it, but instinct kicked in. A photo, me at the church, taken from across the lot, zoomed in. Caption, "She's spiraling, told you she needed help." My spine went cold, not because of the photo itself, but because someone had been watching, documenting, and sending it to who? Elijah? Brielle? Someone they'd looped in to create a narrative, one where I was emotional, fragile, too damaged to be believed. I stared at the image, I didn't look broken. I looked like someone trying to stay still in a room full of knives. I took a screenshot, saved it, then deleted the message. That number would trace back to someone eventually, but not yet. This wasn't paranoia. This was strategy. I wasn't spiraling. I was sharpening. And they had no idea what was coming. 3 days passed, slow but thick. I spent most of them sorting papers, sending quiet emails, and walking laps around the same 3 blocks. I stopped letting myself hope they'd change. I stopped checking for messages that never came. Then the text arrived. Elijah, we need to talk. It's about Mom. Simple. No punctuation, no warmth, just bait. I almost ignored it. But something in me, maybe the last flicker of obligation, drove me back to the house. When I stepped inside, the silence hit first. Then the setup. Delora sat perched on the arm of the couch like a queen on her throne. Brielle leaned against the wall, arms crossed, eyes blank. Elijah stood by the dining table, casual in stance, but clearly braced for impact. No hugs, no hellos, just the slow loading dread of what this was really about. Delora spoke first, her voice coated in concern, too smooth. Venetia, honey, we've noticed things. Your behavior, the stress. You've been under so much. I said nothing, just stood there, hand still on my purse strap. Elijah picked up where she left off. We think it's time you spoke to someone, a professional, just to help you sort through things. He extended a card, a counselor's name and number, a session already booked. Brielle chimed in with a soft, mocking smile. We just want the old you back, the one who didn't look like she was carrying the world on her back. This wasn't concern. This was containment. Their eyes held no fear, no guilt, only strategy. I reached slowly into my bag. The room tensed, but all I pulled out was a folder. Black, zippered. I set it calmly on the table. No dramatics. Inside, a draft legal complaint, a notarized copy of my ownership rights, a timeline of withdrawals from Mom's account, dates and amounts that didn't match her living expenses. Every page a slow, deliberate match to the fire they'd lit. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. You forced my hand, I said. So now I'm using it. Brielle let out a dry laugh. You always loved playing the martyr. I met her gaze, unwavering. Not martyr, witness. No one moved. They weren't expecting that. And in that silence, they revealed everything. Not a single denial. Just shifting feet, clenched jaws, and Delora's barely concealed panic behind her manicured hands. I left the folder on the table, turned, and walked straight to the front door. Waiting in my car was Gia. She was younger than me, early 30s maybe, but had eyes like she'd already seen too much. We'd met at the legal aid office 2 days prior. She didn't ask invasive questions, just listened, took notes, offered resources. Her efficiency had been the sharpest kindness I'd felt in months. Now she handed me a stamped envelope. The motions filed. County will freeze all property transfers within the week. I exhaled for the first time all day. This is real now, she added. I nodded, gripping the envelope like armor. The house loomed behind me. My mother's curtains didn't twitch, but I knew someone was watching. Maybe all of them. I slid into the driver's seat and rested my hand on the center console. Tucked inside was Luca's envelope, the one I'd opened again and again, each time carving a little more clarity into my spine. You don't owe them silence, he'd written. This time I whispered back, but I owe myself justice. I started the engine. Halfway down the block, my phone buzzed. Unknown email. No subject. I hesitated, then opened it. A photo loaded, grainy, slightly blurred. Me and Luca sitting at a cafe in Rome. We looked happy, pre-accident, pre-everything. But it wasn't the photo that froze me. It was the caption. "You sure he died the way you think?" A chill worked its way through my ribcage, slow and bitter. There were no attachments, just that one line. No name, no reply option. I pulled over, parked, stared at the image until my eyes burned. I thought this was about property, about respect. But maybe it was always about secrets buried deeper than I knew. The next afternoon, I stood in front of a rusted orange door in a half-forgotten storage facility off Highway 9. The sun was low, but the heat still sat heavy in the air. I hadn't told anyone where I was going, not even Gia. The email had given me an address, a unit number, and a 5-digit code. That was it. Luca had never mentioned this place, not once in all our years. But as the lock clicked open and the door groaned upward, a sharp wave of him hit me. The space was neat, organized, shelves along the left wall, labeled boxes stacked too high, a small cabinet and a dusty TV on the right. I stepped in. The air was thick with time. Somewhere beneath a tarp, I found a cardboard box labeled in Luca's handwriting. Just in case. Inside were manila folders, a small tin box, and an old camcorder. I froze when I saw the mini DV tape still inside. Dated 2 weeks before the accident. I plugged the camera into the TV and hit play. Luca appeared, tired but clear-eyed. His voice shook only a little. "If anything happens to me, it won't be random. V, if you're watching this, trust your gut. Look closer at the people you think are family. Protect yourself. You have to." I stood in that quiet unit, the hum of the machine behind him echoing into the silence. My hands trembled. I pressed pause, then rewind, then play again. He knew. Even in death, he was still trying to protect me. At the bottom of the box was a key taped to a folded envelope, a bank logo printed in bold, a location, a number. Inside the envelope, a copy of a new will, signed, dated, notarized. Luca had transferred the house entirely to me. No conditions, no shared ownership, just mine. But after his death, everything shifted. The documents filed through probate had named Delora as co-executor. And somewhere along the way, a family claim had rewritten my name right out of the picture. It wasn't neglect, it was calculated. They hadn't just pushed me away to heal. They'd erased me so they could control the story, the house, the money, the legacy. I drove straight from the storage unit to Delora's private office downtown. She wasn't expecting me, but her assistant let me in anyway. She looked up from her desk with that same composed expression she always wore when she was about to strike. "I figured you'd show up eventually," she said. I didn't sit. I placed the documents on her desk without a word. The will, the key, a copy of Luca's video burned onto a USB drive. She didn't blink, didn't even pretend to be surprised. "You think this will change anything?" she said, leaning back. "You think a lawyer won't rip that video apart in 5 minutes?" I didn't flinch. She stood and walked to the window. "You've always been emotional, Venetia. But this is different. Obsessive, dangerous." She turned and handed me an envelope. A cease and desist letter for slander, emotional defamation, and reputational harm. Filed by Delora. Against me. "You've crossed a line," she said. "And your little community project? It's on hold until this is resolved." I looked down at the letter, then back at her. The room felt airless, the walls too tight. She wanted to corner me, again. But this time, I reached into my bag, not for more documents, but for something older, softer, Luca's scarf. The same one I had wrapped around my wrist in the hospital. The one stained with grief. I tied it now, not as a symbol of mourning, but as armor. "Funny thing about silence, Delora," I said, my voice steady. "It doesn't mean surrender. It means I'm loading the truth. Her jaw tightened. I left her office before she could reply. Gia was waiting in the parking lot, standing beside my car with a file in hand. Her face told me it was something big. Inside the file, a paper trail, financial transfers made in the months after Luca's death, from a corporate insurance entity, straight into an account under Elijah's name. It wasn't just grief they tried to bury. It was motive. They thought I was mourning. What I'm really doing is mapping the trap they set and showing them where I'll spring it. It was the kind of morning where the air felt too still. The courthouse steps stretched before me like a final exam. Black dress, black heels, Luca's scarf wrapped gently around my wrist. This time, not for comfort, for presence, for power. Gia stood beside me, clutching a folder so thick it looked like it might snap the clasp. "You ready?" she asked. I didn't answer right away. I scanned the parking lot, half expecting Delora or Elijah to roll up with their usual smugness. Instead, I took a slow breath. As I'll ever be. Inside the hearing room, it wasn't a packed trial with cameras and juries. It was smaller, quieter, but no less powerful. A judge, 2 clerks, a few community board members. Gia handed over our evidence, a timeline of financial discrepancies, forged forms, and the recording of Luca's voice warning me. That one had made the room pause. Delora arrived last, fashionably late as always, but the tension in her jaw told me she knew things were shifting. When she was called to speak, she kept her tone smooth, trying to frame everything as miscommunication between grieving family members. Elijah, too, feigned ignorance when asked about the insurance transfers. I watched his hands shake slightly when questioned under oath. He was never good under pressure. The judge didn't make a criminal ruling. That would be for another court, if it came to that. But the room held its breath when the estate management was officially reassigned. Delora was stripped of all control. The board reinstated my leadership at the community center. They even offered a public statement to clear my name. But the part that truly landed, Delora's face, as the judge said, "There's enough here to warrant further review of the entire estate. We advise you to prepare." That was the first crack. Gia and I stepped out into the sunlight, her phone already buzzing. "You need to see this," she said, tilting the screen toward me. A video clip of Delora leaving the courthouse, eyes ducking from a swarm of reporters. My voice in the background from the recording, calm and clear. "You pushed me to act. Now I will." The caption read, "A sister fights back with truth." It had already hit over 30,000 views in under 2 hours. By the next morning, things moved fast. Delora's charity board pulled her name from their site. Her honorary title as liaison was revoked. She wasn't arrested, but she was uninvited from every table that had once made her feel powerful. I imagined her at the grocery store, catching strangers whispering. Her world wasn't ending in flames, it was crumbling in slow public silence. A week later, I stood alone in the memorial park, the breeze tugging gently at the hem of my sweater. Luca's name was newly etched on a plaque beneath a sycamore tree. I sat on the bench we used to share, the one we swore would always be ours when we grew old. In my hand was the last note he ever wrote me, not a letter, just a folded square of paper tucked in the inside cover of one of his favorite books. "You were always the strongest one. Don't let them tell you otherwise." I didn't cry. I just let the words settle into me. Deep. True. Then, with both hands, I tied his scarf to the bench rail. It fluttered gently, catching the afternoon light. Not a grave offering, a flag, a marker, a promise. Later that evening, I unlocked the door to my new place. A small house near the coast. Quiet. Modest. Mine. I poured a cup of tea, sat at the kitchen table, and opened my laptop. The screen blinked awake to a blank document. Title: Inheriting Fire, A Survivor's Truth. The cursor blinked, and for the first time in a long time, I felt steady enough to write. Gia had already checked in earlier that day, dropping off a housewarming plant and a bottle of wine. She didn't stay long, but her presence lingered, a reminder that not all ties break you. Some hold you upright. I hadn't spoken to my mother since everything unraveled. She never called, never showed up. Maybe she was ashamed. Maybe she didn't know how to face the pieces. Or maybe she never intended to. But I'd stopped waiting for apologies. Distance had become its own kind of healing. And as I stared out toward the faint line of the ocean in the distance, I felt it again. That mix of grief and strength, the strange cocktail that becomes your backbone after too much betrayal. I wasn't the weak one for walking away. I was strong for knowing when not to return. And on that bench in the park, Luca's scarf remained, weathered now, its edges frayed, but still tied, still holding, like me.